So this is our first snippet for this week, which is going to look at 1920s diplomacy in some great power politics and European and East Asian affairs. So this is President Harding with his cabinet. This is Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes. Here we have the Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover is very active in international economic affairs. Harding is a kind of weak president, sort of a compromise selection among the Republican Party. So this is a cabinet which has a significant amount of power. And remember, the Republicans had campaigned as anti-Wilsonian. The idea was that they opposed the League of Nations. But the Harding administration and the Coolidge administration, which follows it, Harding dies in office in 1923, is quite internationalist in many ways. They promote U.S. activity and disarmament. They call for using U.S. economic power to achieve aims. And you can make a case in the 1920s that even if the U.S. had joined the League of Nations, it's possible that U.S. great power politics wouldn't have been all that different. The first big initiative of the Harding administration is the Washington Conference. This is a photograph of the delegates at the Washington Conference. So this deals with East Asian matters. And the issue here was that Britain and Japan had entered into an alliance in 1902, been reauthorized in 1912. It was a 10-year alliance. And the question was, will it be reauthorized in 1922? And the British didn't really want to reauthorize it because they weren't keen on the way that Japan had sort of behaved after World War I. There was this sense that Japan was becoming more aggressive in East Asia, but the British also didn't want to be isolated if they axed the alliance. And so, as a substitute for the British Japanese alliance, and responding to pressure from Senate left-wing forces in the Senate that wanted to decrease spending on arms spending, Secretary of State Hughes convened a conference to address broad disarmament issues. And this conference, called the Washington Conference, ultimately produced a series of treaties, of which the two most significant, I think, were the five-power treaty. So this is between the U.S., Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy. And they agreed to all of them to scale back their naval spending. The sense was in the 1920s that it was naval spending that was really driving arms spending. And this had an impact. This is a chart showing the U.S. naval budget during the 1920s. So pre-Washington, it set around $768 million, and it drops to fewer than 50% of it. British military spending also declines. And this Washington Conference also passes a 9-power treaty and a 4-power treaty, both of which deal with East Asian affairs. In the 4-power treaty, it's the U.S., Britain, France, and Japan. They agree in threats to the peace in East Asia that they will mutually consult. That sounds a lot like the League of Nations. It just applied to East Asia. And the 9-power treaty promises similar consultation with regards to China. So in some ways, this is kind of Wilsonianism without Wilson. They're promoting disarmament. They're calling for international cooperation, at least with regards to East Asia. In Europe, the situation is a little more complicated. So this is the map of Europe. We see all of these newly created states, which we looked at in the snippets last week. France's initial response to the end of World War I is to try to enter into a series of alliances with countries that either would feel threatened by Germany or were newly created and had a kind of stake in the post-war international system. So France, which is here in yellow, enters into outright military alliances with Belgium and with Poland. Belgium, remember, had been invaded by the Germans, so they're very concerned. And Poland is this newly created state that's threatened both by Germany from the west and the Soviet Union from the east. And France also promotes and helps to arm a newly created alliance in East Central Europe called the Little Entente between Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. And these were the three countries in the region who had kind of benefited from the post-war peace treaties. The losers were kind of Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria. So the sense was that they would have a stake as well. And the French idea here is that if they have all of these countries that they are kind of arming and in alliance with that are surrounding Germany, it will make it much less likely that Germany does attack France. And if they do, Germany would face a kind of automatic two-front war. Keep that sort of in your mind for next week's snippets. This is a good idea in theory, but at the end of the day, relying on the Romanian army to benefit the French is a pretty risky thing. Of these newly created states, the most significant and the militarily most powerful and certainly the most functional is Czechoslovakia. The guy here on top is the first president of Czechoslovakia, Thomas Masaryk, who's the founding member of the republic. Czechoslovakia is a network of a number of different ethnic groups. The Czechs, which are here in the blue stripes, ethnic Germans who occupy this territory called the Sudetenland, which is the borderland between Czechoslovakia and Germany. The Slovaks here in the eastern part of the country, the Ruthenians who are sort of affiliated with the Ukrainians in the far east of the country. This dark blue area here in the south are Hungarians, and there's a small section of Poles. Czechoslovakia nonetheless remains, there are democratic elections in Czechoslovakia throughout the interwar period. They built up a quite significant military with heavy defenses here in Sudetenland on the Czech-German border. There's also arms manufacturing in Czechoslovakia, so they're able to produce weapons. So the French do have something in this network of alliances, but it's probably not enough to deal with the Germans. The real problem here is this chart, that all of these European countries are just, economically wiped out by World War I. Even some of the newly created countries carry debts of the countries that they succeeded. And the way the system is going to work out is almost all of these countries have borrowed from the U.S. The U.S. banks want the money to be repaid, and the only way they're going to get the money, these West European countries, is by really demanding that the Germans pay reparations. The problem is the newly created German state is not eager to pay reparations. If you were a German political leader, you wouldn't be either. And so in 1923, the French invade Germany, occupy the far western portion of the country, as they were legally authorized to do under the Treaty of Versailles, to demand German repayment. And the German government decides instead to promote a general strike in the area that France had occupied. And when the strikers say, look, we'd like to strike, but we can't because we're not getting paid if we strike, the central government just starts printing money. But the problem, you don't need to be an economics major to know this, if the central government is just printing money and printing money and printing money and doesn't have anything to back that up, eventually you're going to get inflation. And what happens is what's called a hyperinflationary spiral, where the German currency basically becomes worthless. These are the German Deutschmarks. So you would pay like to get a loaf of bread, you'd have this barrel of worthless currency. So the German government threatened, it appeared as if it might collapse. The U.S., at least temporarily, rides to the rescue here. The U.S. doesn't send nominally a private individual, the chairman of GE, a guy named Charles Dawes, who will then be elected vice president of the United States in 1924, is the U.S. representative at a post intervention conference. But they come up with a plan called the Dawes Plan in 1924, which is modified in 1930 by another plan, the Young Plan. Both of these technically do not involve the U.S. government, so they're maintaining the fiction that the U.S. is not politically involved in Europe, but really they are. And basically, the Dawes Plan, which is it's a cleverly conceived plan, is for a triangular arrangement. The United States, through U.S. loans from U.S. banks, will send billions of dollars to Germany. That will help revive Germany's economy and will ensure that Germany's economy that Germany itself can begin to make reparations payment to the Allies, and in turn, the Allies can then repay their war debts with the U.S. This is actually a system that works pretty well in the 1920s. But the key point with it, and this is something to remember for our last step, is it's all dependent on these U.S. loans. If the U.S. loans dry up, then the other two sides of the triangle are going to go as well. So basically here, as in East Asia, we have a kind of internationalist diplomatic approach by the U.S., and it's hard to imagine how this would have been all that much different if the U.S. had joined the League of Nations. So on paper, things look reasonably well. Under the surface, though, there are real problems, and the problem is the growth of right-wing extremism in Germany through the Nazi Party, but other also right-wing nationalist parties in the 1920s, and left-wing extremism in Germany, which is basically the German Communist Party, and the gradual weakening of the centrist parties. So this is a pie chart of the first election of the newly created German Republic, which is called the Weimar Republic, which is named for its capital, which is a small city in Western Germany called Weimar. And the three major Democratic parties, the Social Democrats, who are here in blue, the Democrats, who are here in orange, and the Catholic Center Party, which are here in gray, collectively had around 3/4 of the vote in the first election for the Weimar party, Weimar parliament. And the party to look at here is the one in orange here, the Democrats, who tend to be a centrist, center-right party. They're very much committed to the Weimar state. Leaders of the Democratic Party often serve key positions in the cabinet. And there's a Weimar coalition, which tends to form of Social Democrats, and Catholic Center figures. And the prime minister changes all the time, but these three parties are all in it. And the Democrats, the Catholic Center and the Social Democrats had been around before the creation of Weimar, but the Democrats are a product of Weimar. And so they get 18% of the vote in 1919. In 1920, their support drops to 8%. In 1924, their support drops to 6%. In 1928, their support drops to 4.8%. And this Weimar coalition of these three parties, the Social Democrats, the Catholic Center, and the Democrats, increasingly contracts. And so you can get a sense within Germany, despite the existence of this of a kind of economic arrangement associated with the Dawes Plan, that significant portions of the electorate are discontented with the Weimar regime. Of course, we all know how this story is going to end. It's not just in Germany where these problems. There are authoritarian, even totalitarian governments that come to power in Europe during the 1920s. The most significant of them, two most significant, the first is Benito Mussolini here in Italy, who establishes a fascist state, a state where right-wing nationalism combines with state control over the economy, very large expansion of the military, and lots of aggressive rhetoric. And on the left, the totalitarian state of the Soviet Union, here Lenin and Stalin, which again create a system in which state power is omnipotent. All aspects of people's lives are under the control of the state. And as with fascist Italy, communist Soviet Union dramatically scales back civil liberties. They build up a massive military. The state controls all aspects of life. And both Italy and the Soviet Union are kind of outside of this system, although Italy remains a member of the League of Nations. The Soviets are not a member of the League during the 1920s. So one of the questions will be, can the U.S. and the countries that are sympathetic to the U.S. and Europe, can they come up with a way to deal with these these major powers which are challenging the post-war liberal order from the far left or the far right? Now, the one way around this is through promoting more diplomacy and perhaps expanding disarmament. And as the 1920s come to an end, there are two initiatives in this regard. The first is the effort of this man, a guy named Salman Levinson, who says that the way to achieve peace is simply to outlaw war, make war illegal. Who thought of who? Great idea. But this idea kind of captures the imagination during the 1920s. And in 1928, largely through U.S. Diplomatic pressure, most of the nations of the world signed this peace treaty called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This is a photograph of the signing, which makes war illegal, makes war a crime. Again, this sounds very good in theory. The problem is there's no one to enforce it. And so the Levinson argument is that once war is made a criminal act, that leaders will be reluctant to engage in it because they'll know that they're engaging in a criminal act, and if they lose, they'll be prosecuted for this. To a certain extent, this is what happens after World War II. Some of the Nazi leaders at the Nuremberg trials, one of the charges against them is that they violated the Kellogg-Briand Pact. But this idea in terms of actually preventing war is a kind of pie in the sky arrangement. And then the second is another naval conference, the last of these 1920s efforts to achieve a more peaceful world order until we move into a very different kind of world. The 1930 London Naval Conference, this is a photograph of the US delegation, which also scales back naval spending. So the basic thrust here is that in both Europe and in East Asia, there are challenges to the liberal order, but the US, even though it's not a member of the League, is actually quite active and probably would not have had much of a different policy, even if it had joined the League. So that's it for our first snippet.